Good morning, everyone. My name's Jen Jacoby, and I am the lead for the Aging in Place Research Cluster. Thank you for joining us today. We would like to respectfully acknowledge that UBC Okanagan is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Welcome to the 10th Annual Okanagan Embrace Aging Month, and thank you for joining us today. Embrace Aging is hosted by the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention at UBC Okanagan, as well as the Interior Savings Credit Union and Interior Health. Thank you to our sponsors. UBC Okanagan has joined the global network of age-friendly universities, and I'm really happy to announce that this membership is formalizing UBC Okanagan's pledge to make our institution more accessible, intergenerational, and committed to research programs and activities that are informed by the needs of an aging society. If you would like to know more about the Age-Friendly University Initiative, have suggestions for us here at UBC Okanagan, or would like to get involved, you can contact the Aging in Place Research Cluster through email at aging.inplace@ubc.ca, or please visit our website at aginginplace.ok.ubc.ca. Now, I'm really thrilled to announce that Embrace Aging is not a new initiative. It was launched 10 years ago to celebrate and raise awareness about positive aging. It has been an enormous resource for residents of the Okanagan Valley, as well as those outside the Okanagan Valley. I'd like to thank Joan Batorf for her leadership in developing this particular initiative for Embrace Aging Month, and really thank her for the commitment she's had to supporting it over the years. Once again, the Embrace Aging Month is organized around a number of educational opportunities and events during the month of March, and we really encourage you to attend as many as you would like. The sessions are designed for everyone, young and old. You don't have to be old to attend. And they focus on a variety of topics related to healthy aging and ways to improve quality of life for older adults, their family, and caregivers. Now, our goal is to inspire everyone to embrace positive aging. So thank you for coming today, and thank you for your support in leading positive aging as individuals. Now, today we've got closed captioning. The closed captioning box can be moved to your preferred place of preference on the screen. You do this by clicking and dragging it to anywhere you do or don't want to see it. Now, to turn off closed captioning, select the hide caption button and it'll disappear, and you won't be able to see the closed captioning then. The other thing I'm really thrilled to announce is that we have an opportunity for you to engage with our speaker today. So if you would type questions or comments for the speaker in the chat box, you can do this throughout the event as well. And then we'll present those questions. I'll present those questions to our speaker at the end of the presentation. So today's session, it's to stimulate your brain, motor imagery as a tool to enhance recovery after stroke. I'm really excited to introduce you to my friend, colleague, and faculty member here at UBC Okanagan, Sarah Kraeutner. She is an assistant professor and she leads the Neuroplasticity, Imagery, and Motor Behavior Laboratory. I love the name. It's called the Nimble Lab, so thenimble.com if you're looking for more information. Sarah's a member in the Department of Psychology here at UBCO and a member of the Djavad, I'm not going to get this right, Sarah, correct me, Mowafaghian Center for Brain Health. Pardon me for that pronunciation. So Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Jen, and thanks very much, everybody, for your attendance today. As Jen mentioned, I'm an assistant professor here at the Department of Psychology and the Center for Brain Health. And I'd also just like to reiterate and acknowledge that we're very grateful to be able to work and play on this land, the unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge all those that have funded and supported my work over the years and our future work as well. So first, just a little bit about me, because I think it's really important for you to kind of get a snapshot of who I am and where I came from. So I did my graduate training, my master's and my PhD over at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Here, I was really focused on what happens in the brain when we learn skills. And so this is approached from a perspective of neuroimaging, so brain pictures or brain scans, also neuromodulation, neurophysiology, but really asking these questions: what happens in the brain as we learn skills? And how can we actually learn skills through different forms of practice? One of those forms of practice, of course, being motor imagery, which is going to be the focus of my talk today. After my graduate work, I then did a postdoctoral fellowship over at the Brain Behavior Lab, located at UBC Vancouver, so the Vancouver campus of our institution. Here, I was really focused on stroke-related neuroscience. So how does the brain change after stroke? And how can we actually relearn skills after stroke? And so now I direct the Neuroplasticity, Imagery, and Motor Behavior Lab here at the UBC Okanagan. We established this lab July of 2021, and our research program is really focused towards the culmination of my training. So here we're focused on understanding non-physical forms of practice to inform their application in health and after stroke. So without further ado, what is stroke? Stroke is a traumatic brain injury caused by a bleed or blockage of blood flow in the brain. It's the leading cause of neurological disability in adults. There's a large number of those who have survived a stroke who experience chronic upper limb motor impairments. So about 85% of people who survive their stroke experience upper limb motor impairments. And when I say upper limb, I really mean hand, arm, shoulder, anything kind of in your arms, parts of your body that you typically use in everyday life. And of this population of people, only about 5% regain full recovery of their hands and arms, while about 20% regain no functional use, so no improvement in function after their stroke. And while this, of course, has economic consequences, it most importantly has personal and social consequences that impact quality of life. And so the takeaway from this slide is that upper limb dysfunction is common and chronic. But I want to focus here and make the point that stroke is a brain injury. So it is the brain damage that is causing these impairments in hand and arm function. So what do I mean by that? If I'm someone who has not had a stroke, if I perform a right hand movement, we're going to see what we call a contralateral pattern of control. Contralateral meaning the opposite side of the brain to our arm. So here what you're looking at is I'm showing a picture of the brain from a 3D top-down view. Left is left, right is right. And I have some brain regions depicted by gray circles. Brain regions themselves are not so important for this slide, but the brain regions are depicted by these gray circles. And the brain regions on the left side of my brain, contralateral or opposite to my right hand, are working together to perform that movement. And as they work together, they're also sending signals and telling the brain regions on the right side of my brain to not be so active. So again, they're sending these inhibitory signals to the right side of my brain as they're working together to produce that right-handed movement. What happens is if I've had a stroke to the left side of my brain, the part that is controlling my right-handed movement, what we see is what's called a bilateral pattern of control. Bilateral meaning both sides. Now, because the left side of my brain is damaged, it has more difficulties actively supporting my movement. And so the right side has attempted to pick up this slack, but it's actually become overactive and is trying to take control. And so at its simplest, we can think of it like this. Before a stroke, we see that contralateral pattern where the left side of my brain is doing most of the work for a right-handed movement. Contralateral, meaning opposite to my hand. But after stroke, a bilateral pattern exists, where now my right hemisphere has become overactive and is trying to control that movement, which ultimately is inhibiting the left side of my brain from being active. Again, bilateral referring to both sides of my brain. And these bilateral patterns are ultimately what underlies motor impairment. But the good news is that the brain can change. And this is what's going to underlie recovery. And this change is experience dependent. So what does that mean? What is experience dependent? Well, I like to think of this as a trail to road example. So let's say there's a trail in the forest that I like to use. And so the first time I experience this trail by myself, perhaps I go for a walk along this trail. Then I start to invite my friends along. And so more and more people begin to use this trail. And as we repeatedly walk over this trail, it starts to get smoothed out and probably widens into something that looks like this. And so now it's wider, it's smoother, more and more people can use it. Now, instead of just walking, we can take our ATVs or dirt bikes. And as it continues to become more and more used, more people and cars are driving over this trail. It turns into a smooth, fast-paved highway. And so repeated use of this pathway is ultimately what's going to smoothen out and make us be able to move faster on it. You can think of a city example, right? So imagine if there was no highway between Kelowna and Vancouver, just a trail. It would take us like, I don't know, 20 hours to get from Kelowna to Vancouver. But with a functioning highway, it only takes 4 hours. And so this analogy is similar to what happens in the brain. Repeated use or repeated experiences is going to smoothen out those pathways, which ultimately allows the brain to transfer information faster. So in the stroke context, these changes in the brain are ultimately what underlies neurorehabilitation. As we repeatedly use it through repetitive practice or physical therapy, it drives changes in the brain, which underlies improvements in function of the affected hand or arm. And so learning is critical to rehabilitation after neurological injury. Neurorehabilitation or physical therapies are all based on the principles of motor learning. And so this is all well and good, but there is a problem, and it's a very big problem. We call this the dose problem. For improvements in functional recovery to occur, it's recommended that you receive 3 hours of therapy each day after stroke. When we look at what's actually received due to a myriad of factors, individual related factors, infrastructure, access related factors, we're only seeing about 1 hour of actual therapy delivered after stroke. And if we take this one step further, we see that people are only receiving about 8 minutes per day for the upper limb. So 8 minutes of therapy is focused on the hand and arm. Again, this is due to a wide number of factors, systemic, individual, infrastructure, but they're only getting 8 minutes. And so it's very critical that we develop and test adjunct therapies that we can use to augment standards of care and physical therapies. And the good news is we can do this because practice does not have to be physical. So physical practice, being the way we move, is really truly the gold standard. Physical practice, physical therapies. But practice itself does not need to be physical to drive learning and to drive those changes in the brain. And so some of you may have guessed very astutely from the title of my talk that one form of practice that we can use to drive learning is called motor imagery. So what is motor imagery? Motor imagery is the mental rehearsal of a motor skill or imagined movement. Again, it's one form of non-physical practice and just one type of adjunct therapy that we're in developing and testing for neurorehab after stroke. And we can perform motor imagery in a couple different ways. We can perform it in the third-person perspective and also from the first-person perspective. So let's try this. Pretend you have just watched Alexia Putellas, Barcelona captain, take a spot kick on TV. So a penalty kick at a soccer match. Now I want you to recreate this mini movie in your mind, if you will. So go ahead and close your eyes and imagine this player taking a spot kick or a penalty kick, and focus on trying to make that movie as vivid as possible. Ready? Go. Okay, bring you back to the talk. The other way we can perform motor imagery is from the first person perspective. This time, I want you to imagine that it is you taking the penalty kick from your own perspective. This time, I want you to really focus on the feelings of the movement. So can you imagine what your body is doing, the timing of the movement? How does that actually feel? Go ahead and close your eyes. Ready? Go. Excellent. Thank you so much for trying that out with me. The purpose of that little demonstration is to show that motor imagery can be used in a number of different domains, sports being one of them, and also that it doesn't require very much equipment to perform motor imagery. And regardless of the way that we perform motor imagery, knowing that there's a few of them, we know that motor imagery is very effective in domains such as sports and music. I believe the statistic now is that 96% of athletes, of Olympic athletes, use some form of mental practice that includes motor imagery in their training regimes. And again, as I mentioned, it's fairly lightweight, meaning it doesn't require equipment or too much guidance. We'll call it constant guidance or constant supervision. And so because of this effectiveness in sports and music, and because it doesn't require too much setup, constant supervision, any equipment, it's been established as an adjunct therapy after stroke. And so here what I'm showing is a few examples of articles highlighting motor imagery for stroke rehabilitation. Now, motor imagery is really presented as this ideal solution in situations where physical practice or physical therapy is limited due to fatigue, due to a number of different factors, but also in situations where perhaps the individual is unable to engage in physical practice therapy due to their level of motor impairment. When we turn to the studies that examine motor imagery in stroke and actually evaluate functional outcomes using motor imagery as an intervention, the evidence is quite mixed. So here on the screen, I just have a list of studies that have been published over the last 10, 20 years. And in these studies, they basically use a motor imagery intervention after stroke and evaluated improvements in hand and arm function. And so any study that you see with a check mark is a study where motor imagery was deemed effective, so hand and arm function improved. But any study that you see with an X means that motor imagery was not effective. Hand and arm function did not improve. And so why is this? Why is motor imagery effective in some situations, but not in others? And this is one of the key motivations of my research program. We want to know why. And so today, for the remainder of my talk, I just wanted to highlight some work where we ask both fundamental and applied questions with the goal of giving you a snapshot or an overview of my research program. And again, all of this work has the goal of understanding why motor imagery is effective in some situations and not in others. And also our goal is, if we know that it's not effective in these situations, how can we make it more effective? So under this larger theme, I'm first going to talk about a basic line of questioning where we aim to look at the differences in the brain's response to motor imagery and physical practice. When I say the brain's response, we focus on the brain's response because the effectiveness of motor imagery, and again, all therapies for stroke recovery, depend on the brain's response to therapy. Second, if motor imagery is different than physical practice, we just want to understand it a little bit more to be able to apply it to these clinical populations. So we want to know, how can we actually apply it to maximize learning? And how can we apply it to maximize relearning after stroke? So kicking it off with our first stream of research, we're just going to dive into a bit of our work and also others' work, asking how it is different from physical practice. Here, I'm going to give you a brief history of neuroimaging in motor imagery. And when I say neuroimaging, I mean pictures of the brain taken as we perform a task. So here what I'm showing is the brain oriented in a couple different ways. I have a 3D representation of the brain on the left side of the screen and a couple different slices, so 2D slices on the right hand of the screen. What we're showing here is that motor imagery and physical practice share neural representations. So here I'm showing that there are areas of the brain that are recruited that are common to both physical practice and motor imagery. So if we go back to our penalty kick example, just by simply imagining yourself doing that penalty kick, so closing your eyes, imagine yourself take that kick, what you're actually doing is activating parts of the brain that overlap with the ones that are being recruited when you actually kick the ball. So now you physically kick the ball. Similar parts of our brain are being recruited. But now we're going to compare and contrast these two practice forms and really focus in on these differences. So yes, it overlaps, but there are some key differences. So here what I'm showing is anything in a red color, also circled by black circles. These show parts of the brain that are more active during motor imagery compared to physical practice. Anywhere that you can see that lime green color or not circled by the black circles, these would be areas of the brain that are more active during physical practice versus motor imagery. And so what we see is that motor imagery is driving activation in a few different and additional areas. In other words, the brain is responding a little bit different to motor imagery than physical practice. We can take this one step further and assess functional changes in the brain after a week of physical practice versus a week of motor imagery. So here what I'm showing is a brain on the left from a top-down view and a brain on the right also from that top-down view. And the lines are showing interactions at a network level. So in other words, rather than showing what discrete parts of the brain are being activated, I'm now showing how these areas are communicating with each other. And so lines represent areas of the brain that are strengthening their communication. And so after 1 week of training through physical practice on the left side of the screen, we show focal changes. So a few areas of the brain have strengthened their communication. But after 1 week of motor imagery practice, shown on the right side of the screen, we see more global changes. More brain regions have strengthened their communication. So in other words, motor imagery leads to different changes in the brain than physical practice. And so the takeaway from this brief neuroimaging history lesson is that learning through motor imagery relies on different neural processes. The brain's response to these two forms of practice is different. And if the brain's response is different during motor imagery versus physical practice, we can't just assume it can be applied in the exact same way as physical practice. In other words, we can't deliver motor imagery interventions the same way as physical therapies, which is kind of what we've been doing. Because when we go back to the crux of our neurorehabilitation slide, we saw that repetitive practice or physical therapy drives changes in the brain that lead to these improvements in function. These interventions are all based on the principles of motor learning derived from physical practice. And so when we replace physical practice with imagined practice, we're still basing these interventions on the same principles, the ones derived from physical practice. But if we instead want to use effective imagined practice or effective motor imagery, we cannot have our interventions based on these principles derived from physical practice. And so in this line of work, understanding the differences between imagery and physical practice will actually help us figure out how it can be better applied to individuals after stroke. And so while I showed you a very brief summary of some of our fundamental work, now I'm going to focus on our applied work. How should we apply motor imagery knowing it's different? What are those ideal practice parameters and principles? So under our applied work, I'm going to show you a snapshot of some past work where we aim to figure out the optimal timing of motor imagery interventions. Then I'm going to show you some new exciting, some upcoming work where we ask what someone should be imagining during motor imagery interventions. So related to timing, one question we ask is, what is the optimal combination of motor imagery practice and rest within a session? Now, if you come from a sports or music background, you might be used to physically practicing something for hours at a time. So I'm a trained musician, and I might sit down for 4 hours on a Sunday morning and just play the same song over and over and over again. But motor imagery is quite mentally fatiguing if you've ever tried it. I would absolutely not be able to sit down on a Sunday morning and imagine myself playing that song over and over and over again. So what we do is we often perform this in bouts of motor imagery with rest, rather than performing one constant chunk of practice. So one motor imagery session might look something like this. Motor imagery, rest. Motor imagery, rest. But it also might look something like this. Motor imagery, rest. Motor imagery, rest. Motor imagery, rest. And so how do we know what is the optimal combination of motor imagery and rest? In this study, that's exactly what we assessed. What is that optimal combination, or that optimal alternation between motor imagery and rest? Is it slightly longer bouts of imagery, or is it quicker, shorter bouts? Now, you might be wondering, how are we going to determine which practice session is actually best? What are we actually measuring? So in our lab, we do lots of behavioral work. We do a lot of different techniques, but specifically here and in this talk, we're going to be looking at the brain's response to these different combinations. And so how do we do that? We use a tool called TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation. So TMS is basically comprised of these little blue boxes, or I guess they come in different colors, but these boxes or capacitors with that figure of 8 looking coil. So that blue butterfly-esque coil. And the coil goes over top someone's head, over their brain regions, over their skull. And by using this coil, which I won't get into how it works, but I'm happy to answer questions on this at the end of the talk. By using this coil, we can actually measure the brain's response. And evaluating the brain's response is, again, so important to us because this is what underlies neurorehabilitation. The brain needs to respond to the practice or the therapy in order for function to improve. So going back to our study, we are focused on determining these practice parameters based on the brain's response. So what we're doing now is, as someone is alternating between motor imagery and rest in slightly longer 6-minute blocks versus 4 or shorter 2-minute blocks, what we do is we measure the brain's response throughout that entire session. So multiple measurements taken throughout. And now I'm going to show you what we found. So here what we have is group, or the timing on the X or horizontal axis. So 2-minute, 4-minute, or 6 minutes in alternating. On the vertical or Y-axis, I'm going to show you the percentage of time that the brain responded in a positive way. And this is going to be shown by white bars. And then the percentage of time that the brain responded in a neutral or negative way is going to be shown by black bars. So in an ideal world, we would want the brain to be responding positively across the whole session, shown by one very, very tall white bar and one very small black bar. And so we showed that the tallest bars, if you will, the tallest white bars, occurred when motor imagery was practiced alternating in 4-minute bouts. So in other words, the brain responded the best when practicing for 4 minutes at a time, and the worst when practicing 2 minutes at a time. When people were practicing for 2 minutes at a time, the brain only responded positively for 66% of the session, 2/3 of the full session. That would be like saying you wanted to get 60 minutes of cardio in, but instead of going for a run for 60 minutes, you went for a run for 40 and then sat on the floor for 20. So you did not get 60 minutes of cardio. And so ultimately, these differences impact the use of motor imagery in practice, with a takeaway from this study that bouts that are too short might actually hinder the efficacy of motor imagery, which might actually explain why some studies showed that it wasn't effective. And so now you've seen a snapshot of how long you should practice for. This leads us to want to know, what should you practice? Is it imagining yourself pour a coffee? Is it imagining yourself play golf? We don't know. And taking this one step further, we're using this, or we're addressing this through the lens of wanting to know how we can best personalize motor imagery interventions after stroke. Because while some of these practice parameters are important regardless of who is using them, in other words, they do generalize, we also need to recognize that there are many individual differences after stroke. No stroke is the same as another, meaning we also need to take this into consideration when developing and working to increase effectiveness of tools for stroke recovery. And so one way we think we can personalize these interventions is by tailoring the task you were to imagine based on your prior experience. So what do I mean by this, and how do we study it? Well, let's take some of our previous work, for example. This is actually from a study I conducted or started and conducted during my graduate training. So in this study, we took a group of experts. In this case, it was a group of varsity basketball athletes. And we asked them to perform motor imagery of a thing they were experts at. So a free throw. Basketball athletes performing a free throw. Experts performing motor imagery of an expert task. We also had a group of novices. So for example, I don't play basketball. I've probably shot three free throws in my entire life. I would be a novice. So now I'm a novice performing motor imagery of the expert task. And what we do is we can compare brain activity between these two groups performing motor imagery of that expert task, the free throw. But we can also ask everybody to perform motor imagery of a novel task, a movement they've never seen or practiced before. And so in this case, it was waving your arm around in a random pattern that we showed everybody right before the study began. So now I have all of my varsity basketball athletes performing motor imagery of a free throw, the expert task, but also motor imagery of a novel task, the random arm pattern. And here we can then compare brain activity between the tasks. And when we did this, we found something very interesting. So here on the x-axis, I have experience. So for the basketball athletes, the random arm pattern would be on the left of that horizontal axis, and the free throw would be on the right of the horizontal axis. And on the y-axis, I have effectiveness of practice, effectiveness based on the way the brain is responding. And so when we do this, we see a less efficient pattern of activity when the experts are imagining the novice or novel task. Brain activity here is shown in blue on that 3D brain. And when they imagine the thing that they are experts of, we see more focal and efficient patterns of brain activity. So more focal and efficient activity during tasks we have experience with. In other words, motor imagery or motor imagery practice is going to be more effective for tasks we have experience with because the brain's response to motor imagery depends on prior task experience. And again, reiterating and really trying to hammer home here that we're focused and so interested on the brain's response because this is the crux of neurorehabilitation. If the brain is not responding in the right way, functional recovery is not going to happen. So now we are translating this work to ongoing work, our exciting new work after stroke. So what we're doing is we're taking the same design, but last time we talked about experts as a whole group or a cluster of people, the varsity basketball team, for example. But strokes, again, are highly individualized. No stroke looks the same, and each individual after stroke might have experience with different tasks. So first, what we need to do is determine the expert task for each individual. And this is exactly what we are going to do in study phase 1. So in this phase, what we're doing is we're first using a comprehensive scale or questionnaire to determine the task. This is being adapted from the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure, which is used in occupational therapy. What we do is we first define a variety of different recreational and daily living tasks. So for example, golf putting, throwing a ball, chopping veggies, using a rolling pin, all kinds of different tasks. Then you are asked to score these tasks based on your prior experience, and then also how satisfied you are when performing them, how important they are to you, and how well you think you can perform them. And we use all of that together to determine your personalized task. This is going to be your own expert task. So in other words, the expert task in this study, the task that's going to be imagined, is going to be based on each individual's own experience. Now, what we want to do is compare the brain's response between this expert task and something you've never tried before. So let's go back to waving your arm in a random pattern, which we'll show you right before the study begins. Now, in the last study, I showed you that we compared brain activity between these tasks. And brain imaging is an excellent tool for a lot of questions that we have. But one thing about brain imaging, or at least certain forms of brain imaging, is that it's an indirect measure of the brain's response. And it's also quite loud. There's actually no MRI in Kelowna, which is, the type of brain imaging we also think of. And what happens in an MRI, the tight space, the loud noises, this might actually detract from someone's imagery environment and performance. So in this case, rather than compare brain activity between tasks using neuroimaging like magnetic resonance imaging, we're going to directly evaluate the brain's response. And linking this back to how the brain changed after stroke, what we're actually doing is comparing communication between hemispheres. But the takeaway here is we are directly measuring the brain's response between these two tasks. And the tool that we're going to use to do this is, again, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. So we're going to use this tool to assess the brain's response and look at how those two hemispheres are interacting and communicating with each other. So bringing us back to the study design, this brings us to phase 2. Here, we're going to directly assess the brain's response and compare the brain's response between the task that you are an expert of and also the novel task. And we're going to do that using TMS. Now, you might be wondering, well, what exactly does a practice session look like in this study? Well, when we asked the question in our previous study, what was the optimal time of a practice session, we showed it was about 4 minutes. So here we're really drawing on some of the previous work and merging it into our new work. And so we found to be 4 minutes. And so in this study, individuals are going to alternate between that expert task and rest and the novel task and rest in 4-minute bouts. And so, as I mentioned, this is ongoing active work. And again, I just want to reiterate why we're interested in this and then what we expect. So because each stroke is highly individualized and because changes in the brain are dependent on someone's experience, we want to ensure we are taking in an individual's experience into how we are delivering imagery-based interventions. Because again, this is not being done, and it might explain why some studies found that it wasn't effective. And so an example of this, a concrete example, is if I'm a chef or perhaps I make pizza on the regular, my imagery-based intervention should probably not look the same as if I were a tennis player or a former tennis player who has never made a pizza in their life. These two individuals may have both experienced a stroke, but their different experiences mean their brains are different. So their brains are going to respond differently when practicing different types of tasks. And so as this is new work, I'm just going to show you what we expect or what we're hoping to find. Now, this is a similar graph as I showed you before. Here we have experience on the X or the horizontal axis, so novel task on the left and your own expert task on the right. And I have effectiveness again on the Y or vertical axis. And so what we're predicting is that we would expect to see a bilateral pattern during imagery of the novel task. So where both sides of the brain are working. But we would then expect to see a contralateral pattern of control for the task based on an individual's prior experience, their personalized expert task. And so the takeaway is that the brain would be responding better to tasks that are based on an individual's experience. And taking this one step further, after this study, we would hope to conduct a longer-term study where we actually employ or deliver an imagery intervention of this nature over a series of months and assess functional change or recovery throughout. So rather than only assess the effectiveness of motor imagery based on the brain's response, we would now be linking the brain's response to improvement in function, which I'm now showing on the Y or vertical axis. But ultimately, from our study, what we're really expecting at the end of the day is to show and to justify that the brain's response to motor imagery after stroke is going to be the most effective when the task is tailored to each individual based on their own prior experience. And this might provide a better understanding of how motor imagery interventions should be tailored to someone, and why it's effective in certain situations, but not others. Because again, we're approaching this from the lens that the way the brain responds is what underpins successful neurorehabilitation. But this is ongoing work, so this conclusion remains to be seen, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the data. And so today, my goal is to show you an overview of my research program here at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. It's really just a snapshot from the program. We can't talk about it all, but I really hope that you can take something away from this talk today. And so if there's anything I would like you to take away, it's the following few messages. The first being, you can learn and recover through motor imagery. So simply from closing your eyes and imagining what you're doing, you can learn. But motor imagery operates or works in a different manner than physical practice, which means we cannot just apply motor imagery in the exact same way as physical practice and physical therapies. So at the end of the day, understanding how motor imagery should be applied will enhance its effectiveness as a tool after stroke. And with that, I would just like to say thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. It was really interesting to learn how it evolved from the beginning setup and the basic research, and now how you're taking it to an applied standpoint with respect to stroke recovery. We've got a couple of questions here, so I'm going to lead off with going back to golf, something that I'm not good at. But the individual who sent the question is wondering, is your improvement measured only by the control changes? Or for instance, if my expert task is golf, do you measure how my golf actually changes after motor imagery practice? I'm intrigued.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we haven't, just to clarify, we haven't done a golf study. In the study that I showed you today, I didn't actually show you behavior. We measure behavior, or we measure motor imagery performance in different ways, but we didn't actually measure physical improvement. But that is a very large focus of the fundamental research program, because it is really important to, of course, link these brain and behavior relationships together. So, if you're a healthy individual and you're learning something, we want to know that not only did your brain change, but you actually improved the skill. And so there's lots of work out there, ours included, that shows that when you learn something through motor imagery by itself without physical practice, you change both your brain and then ultimately also your physical performance. There's actually a golf study. I can link the author after if requested, or the study after if requested. It's a golf study where they compared physical practice, I think 6 weeks of physical practice of a bunker shot versus 6 weeks of motor imagery only versus no practice versus combined physical practice and motor imagery, so like approximately 3 weeks of each. And they showed that imagery alone led to the same amount of skill change on this bunker shot, but the combined version, so imagery plus physical practice, 3 weeks of both, led to the most improvement. Great question.
Great, thank you. Curious question here. How can someone with no experience doing motor imagery learn how to actually do motor imagery?
That's an awesome question. I was hoping someone would ask me about imagery ability. So one really neat thing about motor imagery is that it's a skill itself, as that question alludes to. Not everyone can do motor imagery. In fact, there's approximately 1% of individuals in the whole world identify as having something called aphantasia, which is the inability to generate pictures in your mind, self-reported. And of the rest of humans who believe they can do imagery, the ability is it's not the same. There's a variety or a range of ability. And so one thing that we're also looking into is employing these motor imagery training sessions first before we actually use it in functional recovery or for learning. And so a training session is based on various frameworks, but first, at the very first, the first thing you do is focus on one little aspect of the movement. And then you start adding layers and layers and building up your environment as well with the idea to create a richer imagined environment.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. I imagine there's going to be a lot of people doing imagery training or imagining training after this talk. A couple
I
more.
would recommend try it out.
A couple more kind of technical type of questions relative to procedures. Curiosity about, can TMS being magnetic be performed on an individual with metal plates?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have a number of different what we call contraindications, TMS, or screening criteria. If there's a metal plate in the head, we typically would say no. TMS is not dangerous in the same way that like an MRI is dangerous. So it produces a magnetic field, which ultimately induces electrical activity in the brain. But the strength of that magnetic field the strength of that magnetic field is quite focal. So if the plate is in the head, yes, that's a contraindication or something we would screen for. But if the plate is, let's say you have like pins in your leg, that would not screen you out for TMS because the magnetic field is so far away. Great question.
Okay. Another kind of technical experimental design question here. The individual is wondering about making the novel task more related to the expert task. So for example, using the same muscles. So theoretically, the same brain regions would be recruited in activity as well as imagery. So if expert action involves pinching the fingers, arm waving randomly doesn't involve pinching the fingers, for example.
That question really nails our design on the head. So what I didn't tell you is that the way that we have defined tasks actually controls for these types of similarities and differences, with the goal to actually make the expert task and the novice task or novel task similar in terms of what they actually look like. So as this person astutely stated, if you're pinching fingers in one and waving your arm in the other, that's not so similar. And so in our study, instead of just doing one novel task and one expert task, we actually have 2 expert tasks and 2 novel tasks to help control for these things. And the idea is that we'd be controlling for, making sure both tasks are, say, bilateral, meaning using both our hands, or unilateral, where it's only one-handed. Similar, muscles recruited or used in the task, and just like a similar level of enjoyment and satisfaction. So waving your arm randomly isn't super satisfactory or maybe important to you, but maybe you are someone who has never thrown a dart before, but that sounds kind of fun. So in that regard, dart throwing might be your novel task if your expert task is pitching a baseball. Excellent question.
Okay. And then along those lines, with respect to tasks, someone's curious about aphasia. Does motor imagery work for aphasia?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm not well versed in the motor imagery and aphasia literature. I hesitate only because recently I think I've become a lot more interested in language, because language to me is quite motor, right? Because you're ultimately using muscles to produce our speech. So I think the short-term the short answer is I have no idea. But the longer answer is I would think it would depend on the type of aphasia, whether it's speech production or if it's more of a comprehension impairment. And then also the type of motor imagery. So at the beginning of my talk, I alluded to different forms of motor imagery, and one might be better suited for aphasia than another.
Okay. So it sounds like there's a lot of work to be done there yet.
Definitely.
And relative to work in motor imagery, kind of a twofold question here. Are there any websites for learning about motor imagery? And then does motor imagery need to be like personalized or individualized, irrespective of the paradigms that might be best for the duration of training?
Yeah, those are two excellent questions. So first, when we talk about websites for learning motor imagery, a colleague of mine we have a motor imagery network called the Research in Imagery and Observation Network. And Jennifer Cumming is one of a key contributors to that network. And she has done a lot of work around developing training protocols for motor imagery. Jennifer Cumming and I think it's Dan Eves, they recently, or I guess not recently anymore, but a couple of years ago released a paper on something called layered stimulus response training, which is similar to an answer I gave before about adding these layers into your motor imagery performance. But Jennifer Cumming has, I believe, like scripts on her website, her lab and personal website, about like training motor imagery and also how to deliver different forms of motor imagery that we incorporate in our research as well. And the second question, sorry, what was the second question?
Does it need to be individualized or personalized?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think so. This is the thing, right? Like, why is motor imagery effective in some situations and not others? Well, we often view it as this like one size fits all approach. But when we look to say like the sports literature, athletes aren't doing the exact same mental practice as their teammates. And so we absolutely do need to personalize motor imagery interventions in a number of different factors.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sarah. As we're just approaching the end, I want to build a little bit on this individualized aspect. And learning a new skill is challenging at the best, even when it's physical practice. So what kind of words encouragement do you have or thoughts as individuals are going about learning more about motor imagery and practicing it, whether it be for stroke or for performance in any manner?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Very good translational question. My advice or my words are take it easy and take it one step at a time. Because, you know, as you mentioned, learning something is difficult. And so at the outset, of course, it's important to, you know, take your time with it and really give yourself the time to learn. And then the second part of that is knowing that you're going to fail. And part of this is another awesome question in some of our other work is, should you be imagining errors and failures through motor imagery? And will that help you learn something? Because, you know, when we think of imagining movement, like if you're imagining a soccer star take a penalty kick, you're probably imagining them score. But maybe you should also be imagining some failures, because when we physically practice something, right, like we make errors all the time, and ultimately that helps us learn better. And so to sum up, the words are take it one step at a time, and don't be afraid to fail.
That's great. So just as we're getting close to the end, I'll let the audience know that if you're looking at reaching out to Sarah, on the screen in front of you, you can see the Twitter accounts, both for her Nimble Lab, as well as for her personal Twitter account at Dr. Kraeutner. The other element for at UBC, if you're looking to reach out to Sarah, it would be sarah.kraeutner, her name, at ubc.ca. if you're looking to volunteer or gain more information. And we can definitely put that up in the website link to follow. There is a question there about as a young adult, maybe a child, a person was potentially not paying attention very much in school, but really did enjoy dance. So was rehearsing in her head her dance steps. Were they actually practicing motor imagery training at that point without even knowing it?
I'm going to say, yes, you absolutely were. I think one of the beautiful things about motor imagery is that it can be so spontaneous and isn't necessarily as intentional as physical practice. Like, you know, I lay awake at night and rehearse the talk in my head, and that's a form of imagery or mental practice. And so, yes, absolutely.
And hopefully that doesn't keep you up at 2 or 3 in the morning. Laying there as you fall asleep is different than the middle of the night. Well, as we're approaching the end here, in the chat, if you don't have it open, you can see how to reach out to Sarah and contact her directly. And with that being said, as we approach the hour, I would very much like to thank Sarah today for her presentation. I would like to encourage individuals to attend other events scheduled for Embrace Aging Month. And then please visit our website at OkanaganEmbraceAging.com for all of the events and the registration. And we very much look forward to seeing you at those events and growing this opportunity for residents of the Okanagan Valley to participate both online as well as in person, and for the broader community to see these presentations post-recording as well as online. So our contact information is available on the website for all of these. You will receive an email with a link following this event. It may not be immediately following the event. It's a busy month for us here, but we do welcome your feedback and suggestions, both on this event as well as future events as we go about planning already next year's Embrace Aging events and others in the future. So thank you very much for attending today. I wish you a beautiful Tuesday, almost afternoon, and hope to see you at other events. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to our attendees.